מאזינים יקרים, בפרק זה מתקיים ראיון אשר מתנהל במלואו או ברובו בשפה האנגלית. האזנה נעימה. Dear listeners, this episode of podcast On Meaning is presented entirely, or for the most part of its duration, in English. We wish you a pleasant listen.
Every plus on one student's college application translates to a minus on another student's application. In the process of boosting the application of so-called unrepresented minorities, admissions officers routinely penalize Asian American application, dismissing their diligence and hard work as a lack of personality. How did the widespread discrimination against Asian American students arise in American higher education? Why has the plight of these minority students been so disregarded by the progressives? Today I had the pleasure of hosting Wai Wah Chin, an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute and the founding president of the Chinese American Citizen Alliance of Greater New York, and we have been talking about disparate impact and affirmative action. Hi, we have an important update. Today, June 29th, the United States Supreme Court has found that Harvard and UNC's race-based admissions practice violates the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, thus putting an end to affirmative action in the United States. Today's guest, Wai Wah Chin, has submitted the initial petition to the court, so let's get rolling.
על המשמעות, פודקאסט פילוסופי פוליטי.
Hello, and today on Meaning Podcast, we have Wai Wah from the Manhattan Institute. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me.
So today we are going to talk on a subject that I wanted to talk about for a long time, which is affirmative action. And if you could explain to our audience what is affirmative action and how it is impacting society, I would thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll give you a little background here about myself and my organization, why I'm involved in this. So I'm Wai Wah Chin. I'm the founding president of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance of Greater New York, which is a chapter of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance founded in 1895 to counter some of the problems that came up with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1800s. So we're a very old organization from that sense. And what we've focused on for is civil rights, equal rights for everybody, because it is the rights that count, not the equality, because we're not trying to figure out how to make everybody come out with equal outcomes so that everybody is the same, because everybody is not the same. People are different. But people should have the equal rights to what they can do according to their abilities, to their interests, and to their commitment.
And why do you think that today people don't get the same equal protection against the law?
Okay, well, let's go backwards a little bit.
Yeah, what is the Exclusion Act that you were talking about before?
Chinese Exclusion Act, that was in the 1800s, so that's a long time ago. And so we have to first think that things have changed. What applied perhaps were laws in the 1800s are things that we as a society, as a culture, will change over time. And we have gotten rid of it. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was actually repealed. And that was one that took away a lot of civil rights from the Chinese that came to America, which is the only time that any one ethnic group was treated differently in that sense.
What was the goal of this act? I'm sure it had a goal that the American public argued for.
Well, the goal actually was to decrease the number of Chinese that came because they were working too well, too cheaply. And I mean, they work extremely well. At that time, they helped build the Transcontinental Railroad, which was, of course, very important in those days for connecting the entire country. You couldn't get from the East Coast to the West Coast except by really either going around the world by a boat or by the building of this railroad. And so the Chinese were extremely good in doing that in very difficult terrain and exceeded the expectations, actually, of the builders of the railroad.
And was it the first time that America said enough for immigration?
It was this first time that there was a actual act to exclude a group for that. And it was because of the immigration, because a lot of these Chinese that came over as laborers, they remained afterwards and they were still providing cheap and good labor. So there were some people like Stanford. This is the person who founded Stanford University, who thought that the Chinese laborers were extremely good. And but not everybody thought the same way. And so that's why a law was enacted. But let's jump to the current situation now in America. The concept of affirmative action came out in the 1960s. Of course, there were things that were building up to it, but the affirmative action was actually put into place by an executive order by the president. But what did it say about affirmative action?
What?
Well, what it said is that you shall not be judged by your race. So you will not have race come into as a factor. So it's quite the reverse, because what had happened is that very often people would be employed or not employed because of their race. So they wanted to say, you shall not lose a job because of your race, which is very different from saying you will get a job because of your race. So you should not get into school because of race. That's not what they were intending.
Yeah, like the 13th Amendment, right?
That's right. That's right. So all of this was to stop people from being discriminated against because of race, but not so that you could say that because of race you will get something.
So how do the American people or universities use something that is against race or something that is colorblind and made it something that made people add their picture into their applications to the university?
Well, there's a lot of history to this, and I'm going to actually bring up the Jews, okay? Because at one point, the Jews were, well, you probably know that the Jews do quite well academically.
Yeah, like the Chinese or the Korean or the Asians.
Right. And so in the earlier part of the 1900s, there was a problem also in places like Harvard. In Harvard, they pretty much said that, we don't want to have so many Jews here. And so they start devising ways of getting around it. So they look for other factors, and they'll create sort of images and decide that, we're going to look for things not just academic, we're going to look for certain characteristics, and they'll make things up, which is exactly what has continued.
But was it more easy at the 19th century because all those institutions were Christian institutions, so they could say to someone which is Jewish, you're not in the right club. We're a Christian university. We're not just a private university. We're a Christian university. And a private entity can do whatever it wants and can discriminate against because it was the 19th century. It was legal.
That was the 19th century. But when you're talking about the early 1900s, then we're talking about the 20th century. And so you have a different population also in the U.S. Because in the 1800s and the 19th century, there were not as many Jews. And just like at the earlier part of the 20th century, there were not as many Asians. But America is a nation of immigrants. And so there are different groups that come in. And so what the Jews suffered in the earlier part of the 1900s and the earlier part of the 20th century of the discrimination of them at Harvard, they say, we don't want more than a certain number because then they will become uncomfortable. That eventually came out to let's look at the Asians. And now we feel that there are too many Asians. And how about merit? Doesn't that count? Shouldn't we be focusing on who's going to be people who you want sort of separately from, how do we pick just by race? And what has happened, of course, is that it's not just in the colleges, but it's also in the high schools. So in New York City, what we have is a number of what we call the specialized high schools, and some of them are fairly well known actually globally even, like Stuyvesant High School and Bronx Science High School, which and the top 3 schools, the specialized high schools, generated 14 Nobel Prize winners in the sciences.
Wow.
It's quite amazing because there are countries that don't have that many Nobel Prize winners. And many of them were Jewish, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But they all got admitted how? They got admitted by a race-blind, objective academic test. They don't look at your parents, what your parents do, what the income of the parents are, where do they come from, what gender, race, nothing, religion, nothing. They really wanted to judge just by whether you can do the academic test or not. And that's how they got in, and it produced so many really wonderful students. And what happened is that they decided that there were too many Asians in these schools. And so several years ago, the mayor and the chancellor...
Yeah, who decided those decisions?
Well, in the 1970s, there was a law, a state law, that said that these specialized high schools would admit students only by this test, this one test. So you could actually fail. It
was a regulation that told a specific school, and a specific school only, that it should consider only merit?
Correct. These specialized high schools, not all the schools.
It's a weird law. Why do a regulation to a private school?
No, it's not a private school. These are public schools.
Oh,
these are public schools.
Oh, I see.
These are public schools that are public school students, and so all the other schools can admit any way they want.
Oh,
okay,
I see.
And so, and we're talking about hundreds. There are in New York City. New York City has the largest student population, the biggest school district of the entire country. So there are about 1 million students from K to 12. So that's bigger than many cities. And that's more, as far as students go. So you just have hundreds. There are about 600 high school programs, and only maybe 8 schools are test only. So there are many different ways for you to get into other public high schools. These, though.
And the state says to every school how it should accept students and how not?
No.
No, only to those schools.
That's right. This is the only ones that are by law, because they knew that these were the special schools. Look, there aren't that many schools that generate that many Nobel Prize winners.
Yeah.
They know that something was working well with them. And so if you want to continue to think about merit, about the ability for you to educate the best students in the best way proper, because we're talking about the future. We're talking about, when you talk about education, you're trying to say, how can we develop programs and develop the kids to serve themselves, their families, but their communities and their country and the world. These are for kids. They're 13, 14 years old when they take the test. They're very small. However, there's a lot that can be known by a child already. Okay? And so when they are taking the test at the age 13, they have spent years. It's not like you could cram for a test. Okay? You know that you take years in studying the math, the English, the writing, the critical thinking that takes many years. And so that's what they're being tested on. And when the legislators, this is a very special group of schools, that they were doing this, we have to think about what is it we, as parents and people who are concerned about the community and the future of the society, and also the notion of what is merit and what is fairness, to be judged without thinking about these things that that are not objective. You could do a lot of subjective things that will try to address the affirmative action. No, we have too many Asians. How do we change it? Well, that's not a right question. We should think about how do we get more students to perform well? That's always a good thing, right?
כמה מכם פנו אליי לגבי זה שהם עשו מנוי למידע, אבל לא קיבלו קישור לעל המשמעות פלוס. אז רציתי להבהיר את הדרגות של המנויים לאתר מידע. יש לנו מנוי ב-25 שקלים, המאפשר כניסה למפגש הזום השבועי ביום חמישי בשעה 9. מי שעושה מנוי ב-60 שקלים גם מקבל גישה לעל המשמעות פלוס. פודקאסט עם מעל 200 פרקים שאתם יכולים להאזין לו דרך נגן הפודקאסטים המועדף אליכם, ומי שעושה מנוי ב-120 שקלים גם חשוף לעל המשמעות פלוס, גם נכנס למפגשי הזום השבועים, וגם חשוף לכל התוכן פרימיום שגדי טאוב ועקיבא ביגמן מפרסמים למנויים שלהם. אז אני כמובן ממליץ על 120 שקלים ואפילו יותר למי שיכול, כדי לעזור לנו להפיק את הפודקאסט ולהשפיע על חייהם של אלפי אנשים. תודה רבה. Not only for the students, also for the school, for the level of education, for the community, and for the other students that might go to the school because of affirmative action, and they might fail and drop out.
Correct.
I care really about those who are not at the right level, and they go to this school. They are bright students. They would perform amazing in every other school, but they would fail in this highly academic excellent school.
Absolutely right there. There is something called a mismatch theory. Yeah. And so if you're not matched properly to your abilities, that will happen. And so you see that now. What happened is that as I mentioned, they were trying to change it for the specialized high schools. What they did was they did carve out. There was a little loophole in the law. And so they carved out 20% of the seats so that they didn't have to do so well in the test. So you could miss the test and then later still get in by other means. So that means that 1 out of 5 students is actually not performing to the quality of a lot of the others.
And how does he perform at the classroom?
We have found that in, say, the 2 top schools of Bronx Science and Stuyvesant, that there is a decline in those students. You could see for the students that came in from the regular process and the other process, which is called the discovery program, that there is a significant difference in their grades, in their region score, which is a standardized test. So you could always judge. You don't want to do it just by the teacher's grades, because the teachers often are judging subjectively. And that's why we want to have standardized tests that will be an objective measure.
But do they perform to the extent that they pass the test, or it's just because instead of 90 as an average, they are on the 70, which is
not as bad
okay.
as that. Not as bad as that. Not as bad as a gap of that. However, for the top schools, a gap of even a couple of points means a big difference, because we know that in one of these top schools, the kids who have a 97 and the kids who have a 95, you're actually talking about a completely different tier level of schools that you will get into for college.
Because I read the article by Thomas Sowell, an affirmative action, a worldwide disaster, and he says that sometimes when a student is mismatched and he's going, let's say a black student is going by affirmative action to MIT, he's dropping out. He's not even in 70 as an average. He's just dropping out, and he will never go to college again.
Well, some of them will either drop out, or in MIT very often, MIT is one of the worst places for people to go in by affirmative action, because you're required to take chemistry and physics and bio, and not everybody is good at that at their level, because MIT also teaches at a very high level.
Yeah,
MIT is
very high speed.
Exactly. And so there is, as I mentioned, a theory called the mismatch theory. If you match them wrong, then those who are supposed to go to a local university, they go to one of the top universities, they may often not be able to even study the same topics. So if you wanted to be a chemist, all of a sudden you can't study chemistry. You say, well, let me go and do, I will become a sociology student. And I'm not saying that sociology is bad, but I think that what happens is that it's not the right match. And they could have come out and become an engineer. And you see that you at California, they had affirmative action for many years. And then later, what they did was they got rid of the affirmative action. And so you saw that at the top schools, the number of blacks percentages dropped. And then the secondary schools, they went up. But what happened when they went up? They actually graduated more often at higher percentages and in the degrees in the departments that they wanted. So you could actually be an engineer and get better paid than if you came out as most sociologists do. Okay? So you could become, you could actually do better with your entire life. And the reason that you go to a college is not for that piece of paper. The reason you go is to do better for what you yourself are and also for what you can do, as I said, for the community and the world.
So those students, those high school students that are studying at those elite high schools, do they get a different behavior by their peer students or by the teachers because they're affirmative action students?
Well, that's an interesting question, okay?
Do they know, somebody knows that they are affirmative action students?
Actually, in certain cases they do, and in certain cases they don't. So, because these kids do come in through a different program, because the grades are lower, then they have to go through summer school. And, usually well, if you went to summer school, that means something, right? And so will people know? If the kids are doing very well, it's okay.
Yeah.
But I think that there is that part for schools where they have a lot of affirmative action. It is actually damaging to the recipients of that kind of affirmative action, because there will be always that question in the other fellow student's mind, and even the professor's mind, did this kid come in because of his or her own natural ability and the working ability, or is it by affirmative action? And unfortunately, it penalizes, it punishes those who can get there by their own abilities, their own merit. And as I said, there are several parts of it. It's not just what you're born with.
Yeah, but how? Yeah. How does he feels when something happens, or what happens with the behavior of the other students toward him? We know that teenagers like to, irritate one another, like to say not nice words and things like that.
Well, I think that in the specialized high schools, I don't think that you will see as much of that specifically because of that. By the way, my organization does have a lawsuit against the city for the discrimination, because this is against the law. It is illegal to target any group. You cannot target them because of race and ethnicity. You cannot do that. And so it is unconstitutional. And that's the same thing with the Harvard issue. There is a case that's now at the Supreme Court on this. It's the Students for Fair Admissions against Harvard, and another one against the University of North Carolina. These are against them for these affirmative action policies. It's, you could call it one way or the other. They're trying to play around with the proportions of the students. And, they want to have a certain proportion of blacks, whites, Asians, Hispanics. And that really is an insult to the individual, because when you get in somewhere or you don't get in somewhere, it should be because of your own individual talents and what you do with them, but not because of your race.
But what did the court said? I'm sure that everyone would read, everyone without being a lawyer or something really bright, you read the 14th Amendment, even in his translation to Hebrew, and you say, it's not right. You are right and they are wrong. But what did the court say so far? So far,
it is, we expect a decision actually very soon. We expect it is still in the courts, and so they had the hearings in October, but it takes a while for them to write their final decision. It is strongly believed that they will write and rule against Harvard, and say that what Harvard is doing, what UNC is the University of North Carolina, are doing is wrong. And I should mention that Students for Fair Admissions is headed by Edward Blum, who is Jewish, and he sees this as a common theme, that you cannot have this kind of discrimination. The Jews went through this, it was wrong, and we should not have other groups go through it. So when the Asians are suffering the same thing. We have to speak up. And it's just the same thing that I feel with other things. That when we talk about the attacks, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Asian attacks, they're using the same words on the streets when they attack. They say, you don't belong here. And,
wow.
Oh, yes, you don't belong here. And when you say, what do you mean we don't belong here? We belong here not... You're just looking at us, what we look like, and you attack us and say we don't belong here. But that's what they're saying at the schools. If you say that in their schools, in your halls of education, at your highest halls, like Harvard, that is exactly the kind of message that you send all the way to the smaller thugs on the street. And so we should stop it from the very top so that it doesn't happen at the very bottom.
הרבה מכם שאלתם אותי לגבי מעשר כספים וגם לגבי סעיף 46. אנחנו כרגע עובדים על סעיף 46, אבל הדבר היותר מעניין זה ששאלתי את הרב שרקי לגבי מעשר כספים, והוא אמר לי שכמובן אפשר לתרום חלק ממעשר הכספים לפודקאסט על המשמעות. אז מי שזה מעניין אותו ומי שרוצה לתמוך בעשייה הציבורית שלנו, מוזמן לתמוך גם במעשר כספים או לשאול את הרב שלכם. The way affirmative action is being proved is by that the legal proof is if you show that there is unproportional number of students, let's say in Harvard, like black students, as in the whole community. Like let's say in the whole of the United States there are 18% of black. So if Harvard has less than 18, so maybe, or this is a legal proof, or
no, it's
Harvard
not.
is discriminating against. This is the rationale behind
that is not a legal rationale.
No?
There's no legal rationale to that.
This is what Thomas Sowell said, that this is like a legal something that you put in front of the court, and then Harvard has to show that it doesn't discriminating against someone. This is the beginning of the process.
Well, no, because there's nothing that says that any group has to be proportional to their percentages in the population. There's nothing that says that. If that were the case, no basketball team would look the way it does.
Yeah, of course.
Or no football team would look the way they do. And those are institutions that do also get government money. It's not like they don't, because you do the arenas, do all the, that's a lot of public funding.
You mean the sports teams?
That's right. So in basketball, football, you go down the list that, and you could even look at other fields too and say that, most teachers for K to 12, elementary school teachers, most of them, is something like 80%, 70% are female. So should we change that so that it's 50-50 male-female? And most nurses, even higher percentages, like 80-90% are female.
But this is what they want. This is what the progressive wants. They want a proportional number of everything that counts.
That's right. But
everything that counts, not everything.
That's right.
And people that are cleaning the streets, no, we don't care about proportional representation of women, of minorities, of something like that.
That's right. But just because you want to pick and choose, you don't get to pick and choose by law. By law, you have to say that you cannot separate that out and say, well, we feel like it. That's sort of like bullyism, isn't it? You say, well, with this one I want, and therefore I will change the rules for that. No, it has to be the same rules. It's sort of like saying that you cannot apply certain laws to certain people and other laws to other people just because I feel like it. That's not what is called a just society. But you should also look at it and saying that we have to treat the individuals the same way. That's the equal rights part of it, okay? But we don't go and say that we want equal outcomes, because if we have equal outcomes, the only way you can do that is line everybody up and say, well, you're too tall, so we'll cut off your legs over here so that everybody's will stand the same height. That is the wrong thing to do. But we can give is that it is actually a separate issue. It has nothing to do with the legality of it. As a societal issue, if we want to make sure that all the students are better prepared, and people talk about affirmative action for education and office, also for jobs, also for contracting, for government. We could talk about that later.
Yeah.
But let's talk about just on the education part. If people are not getting into the schools at the same proportion, you could say, well, we can think about what we can do education-wise to improve their outcomes. That's fair for everybody and good for everybody's society. But you cannot say that you didn't do as well, but we're going to change the rules for you. Is that right? That's not right.
Yeah, so the quotas are...
Quotas are bad.
Yeah.
And racial balancing is bad, because you shouldn't be balanced by race, really.
Maybe you should help the poor student or someone that is lacking money for private lessons or something like that, instead of quotas. And if he can perform and if he can pass the test, then he's more than welcome.
For anything, that's right. And I would say that since we were going to talk about a general topic, using law is important, being constitutional, being fair there. And the other thing is to look at it generally, how does it impact society? Because if you have affirmative action that is going to distort the outcome, you will have problems going down forward.
Like which kind of problems?
Well, let's talk about medicine. If you have determined that you want all your doctors to be of a certain race, you have a problem. We do know that the MCAT, that's a medical test that you have to take. Before you apply to medical school, all the students have to take what is called the MCAT. And they had to dumb down the test because they showed that there was a discrepancy. But obviously, it was just a disproportionality, that you found that the whites and the Asians had to have scores that were 50% higher in effect than the blacks that were getting in at your top schools. That is a problem, okay? Because you don't want doctors to be unprepared. And I don't think it is even fair for people to think that, well, we should always have doctors who look like something. Well, first of all, it's not fair to say that people look like something. I mean, another Asian doesn't necessarily look like me, right? But I don't even think that it's good medicine to say that somebody who does not practice good medicine, but just because they look vaguely of the same color, that's the kind of doctor that will treat you. That's not good medicine.
In the same essay, Thomas Sowell says that this discrimination causes racism, because if patients know that blacks are getting into medical school with lower grades, they wouldn't want a black doctor because they know statistically he's a less professional doctor. And even people that are not racist in their lives, which accept everyone, will act in a racist way because of the racism that is in affirmative action policies.
I will stop and say that is not racism, but it is being rational. If you know that what the statistics are, you will say, I have reason to have some concern unless I get proof. Now, you should not be disregarding the proof, because there are great doctors of every single background. But we know that sort of on the average and as a group, you may have better doctors of one case or another. Now, I will just tell you that just about all my doctors happen to be Jewish. I did not choose them because they were Jewish, but I chose them because they were good doctors, okay? And so I think that's important for people to know that we have to look at the individual person and the individual qualities that you're looking for. And so this whole notion of trying to manipulate, it should make us scared, okay? When United Airlines says that their goal is to have 50% of their pilots be people of color and female. And you say, shouldn't you try to aim for the best pilots, whatever they look like? I mean, I'm more concerned when I'm on a plane that I have the best pilot for for my trip, as opposed to they check the box on a color or gender. That's not what we want. And that would apply for many other fields as well. I just take that as an indication, but that's not the only company that's doing that. But when you're medical schools, when you're engineering schools, you think about all these ways that your life can be affected. We shouldn't be doing that to that individual because there's the mismatch too. When there are students who are choosing careers that they might not do as well as in this place. Maybe you shouldn't be a neurosurgeon, but if you went to another school where you got better grades, and you got better training in your bio and your chemistry, and one of the most difficult ones is organic chemistry. That's the killer class for a lot of the people that weed them out. Don't dumb down the course, but make sure that the kids can rise to it. And if you can't, that's no shame. There's no disgrace in choosing something else or choosing another school that fits you well.
Actually, what you just said really reminds me of Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukiano's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And they say that one of their mottos is prepare the child for the road and not the road for the child.
Right. Jonathan Haidt has a very, very right too, that we don't think about the kids as being free to pursue, that's agency, the right thing for themselves. And we have to give them more agency as opposed to affirmative action. Affirmative action actually takes away agency. It takes away the ability for an individual to really produce and contribute in their proper manner, as opposed to affirmative action is something that's given to you. It's not what you did.
Many people in America of today are talking about historical compensation of the current black or white by the one who, let's say, whites in general own slaves. So right now, whites in general should pay compensation to all of the blacks, even if, some of them came in the 20th century and some of them came, some of the whites came to America in the 20th century. So why would someone that his fathers didn't own slaves would pay to someone who wasn't a slave and that came to America by choice? And what Thomas Sowell says about it is really nice. So I would quote, "Few people would accept this as a general principle to be applied consistently. However, much they may advocate it out of compassion or guilt over the fate of particular unfortunates. No one would advocate that today Jews are morally entitled to put Germans in concentration camps in compensation for Nazi Holocaust."
I think that's absolutely true. I think that the notion of this kind of reparations is extremely regressive and divisive and unjust. It's, as you said, that most of the whites that came to America actually are in America now, came after slavery ended. The influx of the Italians, the Irish, the Jews, all of these, which form most of America now, are not slave owners, and there was not slavery up in the North either for the longest time. And so, to look back for the white slave owners, and also we should not be judged by a group. This whole sort of group justice, of group reparations, we have to judge by the individual. It's sort of, that kind of group justice is the evil that Hitler did. For him to say that a whole people should be judged one way, why, that's pretty outrageous. Because this is the identity politics that goes on, which we should never indulge in. It's inhumane. It dehumanizes, really, each individual. And so to think about reparations, if an individual owns slaves, we could go back to that person and say, you did that, you pay up.
But they died.
They died.
Yeah.
That's right. And I don't think we are going to go to the current Germans and say that, well, we're going to do that.
Put you in concentration camps.
That is absolutely ridiculous too. And then we have to think of California, which is the one that you're probably thinking of, that has also already had set up in motions the reparations question. But think about reparations. California was never a slave-holding state. Nobody was. And so
it was Spanish back then, right?
It was during a lot of the part of slavery. It was Spanish, and then by the time it became a state or entity, they never had slaves, and so they never made it all the way out there. So this notion of trying to find in California, which has a lot of Hispanics and a lot of Chinese, Asians, there's a huge Asian population, and the whites who moved out there, none of their ancestors probably had any slaves, and many of the blacks there. Let's talk about it too. That most blacks in America also will have some white blood in them. And so now are we going to get into that one-drop theory, which, again, is an anathema to people who are thinking.
What's this theory? I didn't heard of it.
This is if you have one drop of black blood or, one drop of whatever blood, and then you consider it. But yourself black or this is a sort of funny identity politics that's going on. And people are making jokes and say that, well, anybody who's slightly black, you want to establish residency there early. Actually, it's not as crazy as that, but it is because they do have residency rules and things like that. But still.
Actually, this blood theory really reminds me the Nuremberg laws. So I'm a history teacher, and all these weird laws are really making me, nervous. Yeah.
We should not be doing that. We should never be looking at it and saying that, well, we're going to look at your ancestry and start giving you extra points or demerits for that. So what we have to do instead is try to see ways that we could equalize people by their rights, because not everybody is going to be born with the same native abilities. Not everybody is going to have the interest in pursuing certain opportunities, and then they will not have the dedication. You have to actually do the hard work for it, and so that's what you have to have.
What do you think makes the Asians so superb in academic or stuff like that?
I should ask the Jews that, but actually, I think.
Yeah, but today it's really fashionable to talk about Asians, to learn from academic skills and education and merit-wise.
Well, I think that it's the same things very often. It's having that kind of nurturing from the whole community, that the parents must set a good example. And I think that in both cases, for the Jewish community, the Asian community, we have more intact families than a lot of other groups. That's one thing. Let's be direct about it.
Yeah.
Right?
People like kids need their father near them and their mother. And an intact family is something that really privileged the kids. Make them.
It's not a privilege. It is a sacrifice too for some parents.
Yeah,
right?
of course. Yeah. So what I mean, I'm using the words of the progressive in order to show other points.
Correct. Yes, when they call it a privilege to be in a family, that is absolutely outrageous. Because we should not think of it as being a privilege, but it is a commitment. And so whenever the progressives like to say that somebody has a privilege, it's basically a way of saying that, well, I don't have it, and therefore it must be a privilege that somebody got something that I didn't have. No, it's not that.
I'm just saying to my audience, maybe if you really care about your kids, so stay married for your kids, even if it's not exactly the right relationship that you imagined when you were totally in love back then. For your kids, it's better to stay married.
Well, I think that they should think about it in terms of like the entire family. It's not just being married, but you have to set a good example too.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that you're going to stay married and fight each other, but
Yeah,
but you
of
have to say that we're going to provide the kind of environment that says that there must be structure, and work is hard. It's not, that's why they call it work. They don't call it fun, right? And so you have to study, because study that learning comes by studying. It does come by some work, and the work will make you happier with it. When you know it better, it becomes more fun. It's not like it doesn't come just like that. And to do that at an early age is something that we would encourage everybody. And that's the same kind of thing that I would say when you say that Asians do better. Well, it's that. And also, I would say there's the culture of learning. There's the culture of accepting that tests gauge what you're doing so that you can measure and say, okay, if I'm not doing as well in this, let me understand why. And, it's a tool. A test is a tool. It's like a thermometer. It knows that you're sick or you're not sick, and in this way or that way, and you try to improve the way students will learn. And then after that, you can try to find ways of having other groups do the same too.
Do you know how meritocracy is being treated in China?
They still use a lot of tests there, and they do very heavily weed out students who are not doing as well. They do take it seriously. And so, obviously there will be some cases where some people will pull connections, okay?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, but I think that as a general rule, their schools are run better. And so that they will try to, at the earlier stages at least, make sure that the kids will learn their basics. And that's very important. You don't see it as much perhaps over here in Israel, but I think that in the U.S., there's unfortunately a decline in the education performance as we try to have a lot more of the sort of critical race theory type of thing taking over the basic academic learning. And that has to be pushed back.
So we have something to learn from China, maybe things that we already forgot?
Yes, things that we forgot. And of course, recognizing that it's not perfect, okay? They don't have the perfect answer to, but I think that at a certain level to have kids know that they have to show up to do the work. Teachers are teachers. Students are students. Teachers are not your friend. So that's something that happens in the U.S. when all of these students are calling at kindergarten their teachers by their first name. It sort of disrupts the organization, and the teachers will say, "Oh, I'm not here to teach you. You can learn amongst yourselves." No, that's going to delay the learning, and that's not what they do in China. The teacher is the teacher, and we know that a 5-year-old should not be as smart in most cases as the teacher. And for the teacher to pretend that the kid is as smart as the teacher and say, "Oh, you're perfect." No, this is one of the coddling of the children's minds that we should not do. And we have to make sure that the education has high standards. And that's one thing that China does still maintain. They're still maintaining the standards, whereas in the U.S., it's quite the opposite. We're trying to take away standards because we're scared that the standards show different outcomes. That's okay. Different outcomes is all right. Don't change the standards. Change the way people get to meet the standards.
Like how would you example this kind of thing?
I'll give you an example that, say, in Harlem, in the more black and poor areas in New York, the public schools, many of the public schools are just absolutely horrible for the kids, okay? But there are some charter schools, which are still public too. They're public schools, but they run differently. The kids are doing much, much better. Same community. And in fact, I will tell you that out of the 25 top public schools in New York City, they're public. The kids don't pay. 23 of the top ones in math scores are all charter schools. They're charter schools because the kids are performing better because the structure and the instruction is better.
And the incentives that are applied on the teachers are not part of a union. Nobody defend the teachers against being fired. So the teachers can't be lazy. They have to prepare to their class, come on time, and give the show of their life.
Well, yeah, show of their life, yeah. Yes.
I tried. I'm a teacher, so I'm trying to give them the show of my life every time I enter the classroom. Even the less, I have a tenure and I can't be fired.
Right. Well, that is true that the tenure is different there than here, probably. Tenure is for teachers. Originally, it started off for professors, and I can understand that for their intellectual pursuits and making sure that you have that kind of ability to do the free thinking that you need. For kindergarten to after 3 years to get tenure, that's a little bit odd. That you can have lifetime employment after 3 years, that's stretching it. So I think that it's, as you say, a little bit of standards also for the teachers is good, so that they can think of how to instill the best in their children all the time in their different levels of learning. That would be great.
If you could take one thing and change it in the whole American education establishment, what would you do? Just one thing for the closure of this interview.
Well, that takes us a little bit away from affirmative action, okay? So affirmative action, I think we know how we should address that and really go with equal rights as opposed to looking at the external superficial qualities of people as opposed to their abilities to perform. But I think for education, what we should do is have more school choice. And so for public school parents and families to be able to choose where they send their kids, that would increase the competition amongst the public schools so that they can perform better, develop the higher level and standards that we want for all our kids.
Actually, Thomas Sowell has a great book about it. It's his last book from 2020. It's called Charter Schools and Enemies. And I know he's over 90, but he's going to publish another book. I'm not sure what's the subject. I think it's about social justice and the fallacies or something like that. Maybe this is the name. So I really want to thank you. Wai Wah, an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute and the founding president of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance of Greater New York. Thank you.
Thank you so much, man.
על המשמעות, פודקאסט פילוסופי פוליטי.